Welcome to Team Talk. I'm delighted to have Mike Bates with me today. Hi, Mike. Welcome.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
What we're talking about today is what makes high-performing teams, what that really means. And one of the reasons I've invited Mike on, because he can give a brand new perspective. Mike has spent 11 years in the inventory, um, and then 10 years ago, I think he made the transition to civilian life. Uh, and I think there is a lot that Mike does in his daily organisation now. So um, he is an organisational design specialist and a business psychologist. Also happens, like me, to be a father of two girls. Um, and I think when we met before, you were passionate about a couple of things. One was helping individuals like you make that transition into civilian life, and two was helping teams. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, that's right, James. I think when we leave the military, we lose that support network that you have with the people around you, that mindset, and transitioning out into the civilian world can be quite daunting for people. And I think the longer you serve, the more difficult that challenge and transition is. And I certainly have made a few mistakes and learnt a few lessons. And if I can help fellow veterans or people transitioning out into civilian workplace make less of those mistakes and transition smoother, then I'm all for that as well.
Excellent. Well, let's take a dive into the military, because I guess teams teams seem to succeed in the military pretty well. That's just an outsider's perspective. Um, How do you? Let's start right at the top in terms of how does a military define high performing teams, Mike? How do they look at it?
Yeah, I guess there's no sort of special secret sauce that you probably expect from an answer, certainly from someone who's served. But I think at a real base level, and it's going to sound very similar to any high performing team definition, it's a group of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think the difference, certainly I feel, is the mindset that the military install into its people of doing things beyond what you thought was possible. Now, that could be from a physical perspective, that can be a mental, or a mixture of both. And often it's finding a way around a problem that you hadn't thought about before
Right.
through mission necessity. So you've got the pressure of normally a timeline, and that definitely links across to the civilian workplace as well. The other thing that the military does really well is takes people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, creeds, races, religions, and brings them all together.
Nice.
And gives you a common purpose. That can be a mission, goal, objective. Very, very similar in the civilian world as well. And they bring you together in an environment where it is different from the civilian world in the sense that you've got different set of circumstances that you find yourself in, very different. It's a high stress, high pressure environment. And you have a mission, an aim that you have to achieve. And it's bringing those people together for the success of the mission and the outcome. And it is team before self. So you're always thinking about the team, always thinking about your fellow soldiers, in my case, and how you can work together to support them in achieving their aim. And there's an element of sort of self-sacrifice that comes along with that. But coupled with that is a sense of great achievement, that you've done something that's greater than you and greater than the sum of all its parts in achieving an outcome.
This is going to sound like a stupid question, Mike, but what does team before self really look like, sound like, feel like? Because everyone's going to relate to the theory. You've probably all read that 20 times in a book or heard it on a blog. But for somebody who's lived it, can you give us a bit more?
Absolutely. So one of the things I often talk about is we have a saying in the army, and I think military wide is being Jack. So quite simply, if the term "sod you, Jack, I'm all right," that would equate to if you did something that benefited you and not the team, then that gets called out very openly and sometimes quite confrontationally with people.
Right.
Even down to something as simple, James, as if we're in barracks and I go to make myself a brew or a cup of tea, and I don't offer the team in the room a cup of tea, people would say, "Jack Brew, like you've sorted yourself out. You
Nice.
sort everybody else out. How it also breaks down in reality. So in the infantry, we carry a lot of specialist kit and equipment. It weighs a lot. So for all of the team to succeed, people would carry different equipment. So I might be patrol medic and I'd have a medical kit. So if anyone got hit, then I would look after them medically wise. Equally, if I was hit, then people would know where my medical kit was. You might be a sniper, so you'd have a long range rifle. You might be demolitions expert, so you'd have demolition charges, things like that. So everyone had a role to play and a specialism. However, the one thing I think that works really well in the military and less so outside, and I think that's probably a costing more than anything, is that everyone was trained to a certain level in other people's jobs or have an understanding of how to do it. Even from a medical perspective, you might have a real base battlefield first aid qualification, and you can essentially pick people up and drop them into different teams, even different units and across the army, and you can function as a team. And knowing that actually through training, you start off as a set of individuals, basic training, and you are, I guess, institutionalized into a way of thinking that can serve you really well when you leave, but also can have its problems later on down the line. But it team versus self is that you do something for the team rather than for yourself, even as something simple as making yourself a cup of tea. You make sure that from a commander's perspective, it's making sure that the guys and the girls have got, had food, had water, have they cleaned their weapons, have they changed their socks if we've been out all day patrolling and so on. And you look after each other and you expected that works both ways. And if you do something that is inherently selfish, then that is called out. And in such a way that you kind of think, well, I don't want to be outside of the group, I want to be part of the group. And therefore those sort of pro-social, pro-team behaviours are developed through the behaviours of others within the team.
Okay, so is there anything out? I mean, it's called out in, sounds like not the most positive way, but for a positive intent.
Well, yeah, I think this is where I think the word conflict gets kind of a nasty name and people fear it. And there are ways that we pull things out in the military that just wouldn't work in a civilian context because people would just find it too uncomfortable. But
Yeah.
Psychological safety is about admitting mistakes, is about asking for help in an environment where you feel that there's no negative consequence for doing that. So equally, sometimes you put your hand up and say, look, I didn't serve the team there. I sorted myself out rather than helping the team out and therefore apologise. Or, in the civilian world, it's a little bit different. You might have to do something for yourself. And that is in contrast to serving the team. But actually your personal need at that time outweighed the need of the team. So I'm not saying it's as black and white, although the military can be
absolutely.
as that. But ultimately, the other thing I think contributes to maybe some of the selfishness that we see is proliferated through social media, where it's a dog eat dog world, and you've got to do X, Y, and Z to get ahead, and you're fighting everybody else, and you're in a competition with everybody else, and that's just really not true. There are lots of people, and I know, James, you do psychometrics with P, and you can find people that are very team orientated and not necessarily leader orientated, and therefore they get a lot of sense of being part of a team versus other people that can be very self-centered and self-promoting. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because in the right environment that's what you want. But actually, from a getting stuff done and achieving the aims and objectives from a business perspective, it's like, well, how do we take these individuals and how do we get to think as a team? And I think that's where the challenge lies, and this just as well as I do, is how do we get people thinking about each other rather than thinking about ourselves and what we need. And often we can serve those needs and meet those needs by serving other people. And I think there's something really quite great about service, whether it's military service, whether it's volunteering, any form of service, I think can really fill your cup up from intrinsic self-worth perspective. And I think that's something you need to tap into when you're thinking about how do we get a team to work together effectively.
Yeah, no, I do. Is there what other advice would you give a leader that was looking to promote this kind of team before self in the civilian world?
Yeah, so I think the common thing is having that goal and that mission, if you like, to work towards. And people have to be bought into that. So, for example, in the military, if we were going to go and, say, strike a target, if you had people on the team going, well, I'm not sure this is the right target, or I don't think I should be striking targets, then that person's mindset is not the right mindset for the job you're about to do. And that can be, in that situation, extremely dangerous. If you've got people there, and ultimately, not sort of beating around the bush, some of our roles in the military is to protect, and some of that protection would involve striking or a target or an enemy. If you've got somebody who doesn't want to do that, hopefully you identify that quite quickly, and then you have the conversation around, well, are you the right person for this task in this team? Or is there a way that you can repurpose that person's skill set in a way that serves the team, maybe indirectly? So sometimes that could be moving someone outside of the team to play more of a support function. Sometimes it could be that, as you've heard of the saying, are you on the bus, are you off the bus? It might be that actually the way that the teams evolve, the way the business is going, that person's values, their purpose doesn't align to the business. And that happens, and that's fine. But it's having an adult conversation to say, look, Fred, we've noticed that, or I'm certainly noticing that there's a lot of misalignment here, what we're trying to achieve and your values and principles, or even some of your behaviours, because it often manifests in the behaviour. And this is where that conflict piece comes in again, because sometimes it's just as direct as saying, look, I'm observing some real resistance from you here. Could you tell me a little bit what's going on for you? And people tend not to have those conversations because they fear the response they might get. They know something's up with Fred, but actually, if I don't ask him, then I don't have to know. And there's an element of ignorance there. But you can't afford to have that ignorance in the military, and therefore the questions are asked quite quickly. And you find out quite quickly whether people are in the right mindset or not to do that job. And equally, the better you know your team and your people, the better you know when something's up, and you can be quite intuitive about that as well.
Absolutely, I think we commonly come back to similar ground on here, and actually, just getting to know your people better is one of those. It's one of those points.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think one of the misconceptions about the military in general is that, I remember for a few roles when I first left, a few gigs, people saying, well, it's all right for you in the military, you just tell people what to do and they do it. The civilian world doesn't work quite like that. And I think, well, yes and no. There are jobs in the civilian world where people are told what to do and they do it because that's the way it works. And equally in the military, sometimes you need to tell people what to do and they'll do it. High pressure conflict situations, you don't want people going, well, do you think that's the right course of action when you've got bullets flying over your head and indirect fire coming in on your position? You don't want people to start quizzing you on that. We kind of iron those bits out way before we get to the point where we're in contact and have those discussions and talk about things. Yeah.
Let's address that elephant, Mike, because there's we've talked here in the same context about mindset. One is the military has really opened your mind to things that you couldn't do.
Yeah.
On the other extreme, and I'm talking in a massive generalisation, so please correct me, because what I'm after is what really happens that people can learn from. On the other hand, people say, well, at certain points, then you're not necessarily paid to think, aren't you? You're there as a part of a unit to act. Yeah. That might be wrong, so correct me. But I'm quite interested in how you balance and go between those two mindsets, what people could learn from that. Because one's really expansive, isn't it? And one might be focused.
Yeah. It really depends on the task you're doing, right? So you would have heard, and businesses will have these as well, but from a military term, SOP, standard operating procedures, which is a set of ways to do something that's standard, and they're standard pretty much across the army within a certain context. So, for example, when we are in a firefight, there are certain standard operating procedures that every individual within that patrol, platoon, company would know how to do without thinking, because that would save your life. Is, I do this, then I do this, then I do this, and you drill it so much that becomes second nature, or you're starting to be in that unconscious competence stage, like driving the car. We're using that model. Now, you're not paid to think. You're not going to think, well, are the rounds really striking close to me? What should I do? Right, it needs to be quick. It needs to be fast to save that person's life or to save the patrol's life if you're in a contact situation. So there are situations like that where we'd run an SOP, and there is the same in a business, right? There are situations where X happens, we run this SOP. Y happens, we run this SOP.
Because it's quicker, yeah, isn't it? It's quicker, it's more efficient. People know what they're doing.
Yeah, and there's the research into decision making fatigue, where how can you, if you're making constant decisions and you're really thinking about them, you can either overanalyze them and then make no decisions, or you get decision fatigue from making too many decisions over a kind of intense, prolonged period of time. So some of this is about human factors and how we can mitigate some of the errors that we make as human beings when making decisions in high stress situations. Now, don't get me wrong; it might be that actually we run that SOP and realize over time, it could be that we work in a different operational environment. So Afghanistan, Iraq, I guess more recently Mali. How does that SOP run, and is it still effective? So there is an element of retrospective, or we used to call them AAR, after action reviews, which again businesses have taken on and looked and kind of made their own as well. It's looking at how did you deliver what you were supposed to deliver? So how did you deliver the mission in that case? What did we learn? And it could be that actually our enemy has evolved, just like your competitors will evolve. And what you used to do as an SOP is no longer relevant or no longer serving its purpose. And therefore you will evolve the SOP to meet the demands of the environment. Very, very similar in the civilian world where, if you've always done what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. That's great if it's giving you what you need. However, if your competitors have evolved, then you need to think that as well. And that's when the whole "you're not paid to think" is wrong, because you then go, well, actually, we're now thinking about that's not working and we need to evolve that in order to survive or thrive in the environment that we are operating in.
Yeah, it's almost that you've been intensively trained to act in the right way without having to think, that for the benefit of your life, for the team, for
the
purpose of the mission.
The repetition is mother of skill, right? So the more you do something, the more it becomes a skill. And there's an excellence quote about something you continually do. I forget what it was. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So, but then equally, you can be very good at doing the wrong thing. So if you haven't reviewed it, if you haven't looked at, is this still serving us from an organizational perspective? Or equally, outdated behaviours that worked 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago don't work now. And therefore, updating that software, if you like, internally in your own head, right? How we used to think about this has changed. If we're talking more from a holistic perspective, how workplaces have evolved to be more inclusive, the psychological safety aspect is definitely front and centre for most organisations. Corporate social responsibility, all these things going back 20, 30 years ago weren't as prevalent as they are now. And therefore, that's an example, even from a team perspective, is how do we think like the business needs us to think in order for us to be successful in line with the strategy, the vision, the mission, the purpose of the organisation.
It is quite interesting because particularly new leaders I come across, they may have read a lot about leadership and the freedom that you need to bring, some of those elements. But standard operating processes, procedures, it's actually a standard management practice in a way, isn't it? And I think it's almost key to define when you need them and when you need someone to go beyond and have freedom and think. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, no organisation, the military or civilian context, wants automatons that just turn up, do the work, and that's where you kind of say that AI and machine and technology have kind of replaced those repetitive roles that don't necessarily, you get a chatbot every time you're online now. And we're slowly removing the human connection from things, which I think is, in my opinion, a mistake. But for stuff that's kind of low risk, low level stuff, then a computer or an AI simulation can deal with that. But yeah, we want people to think. We want people to be innovative, collaborative, fresh thinking as well. But I suppose if we're taking it more broadly, James, thinking about the impact that social media has had in general on how people think, feel, and behave, the impact that modern media has from the big news networks and the radios, and you're conditioned and primed to think and feel in a certain way. If you're led to believe everything that goes on in the media, we live in a very, very hostile world that everybody's out to get you, and there's no nice people in the world, and it's very, very negative. And that does have an impact on people as well, where they think, well, this influencer, and I use that word loosely, is doing this or that, and so on. But again, it's only showing people a very, very small snippet of a situation. There's lacking context there. And actually, when we're talking about skill shortages across organizations, critical thinking and collaboration are two massive ones that organizations are really struggling with. So I think the influence of outside thinking, be it the social media influences, the news in general, that can definitely stymie how people think creatively, and they don't give themselves time. And this is the thing we're all short of and poor of, to go, right, well, what is it we're doing, and how could we do this a bit better? And not necessarily thinking I can do that in 15 minutes. It might be that you spend some time over a month looking at it, an hour a week, for example, to look at, well, is this still the right thing to do, or what can we learn from doing things slightly differently? And from a psychological safety perspective, giving people opportunity to I think it's termed as intelligent failure. So you set yourself up to try something. From a scientist's perspective, what's the hypothesis? Let's run this. Let's see what works, what doesn't work. And then taking those learnings and applying it real time back into the workplace without fear of being dragged across the coals because you tried something that didn't work.
And how do you get that opportunity to experiment within the military?
Within reason, yeah. I mean, we've got rules, and we've got certain laws. So the law of armed conflict, for example. But experimentation could be, it could be we're assaulting a building, and actually the easiest way to assault a building is clear it top down. But most of the time you're going to go in through the front door, which is bottom up. So, it could be that, I remember years ago on a training down in Salisbury Plain, again, it was a bit unconventional, but sticking a ladder on the back of a Land Rover and driving up quite quickly to this building, and guys piling in through the top window rather than going in through the door. Now that doesn't take the brains of a rocket scientist think, we could put a ladder there, but the dynamic thinking of put it on the Land Rover. Health and safety was not a priority at this point, and I'm sure we could get a bit of bollocking for doing it, but actually we cleared the objective quicker than we would have done if we tried to fighten up the stairs and so on. Right. Now that's an example in the military where you can think differently. Again, we have certain things that we do from a safety perspective, and that can be that we've got different assets on the battlefield. So it could be that you've got mortar fire coming in, you've got fast air or rotary air above you. So you have these different things in place to keep us safe. However, problem solving real time in challenging environments is actively encouraged. And it could be the most junior member of your team comes up with something that will work because they're not necessarily jaded or conditioned to think groupthink like the more seasoned people within the team. And that's where the whole fresh eyes perspective in a business can really add some value. And getting someone to come in and look at a problem without necessarily having all the previous experience and knowledge that can set them to think in a certain way can be really, really beneficial. But also, I think some of it does come down to the leadership to say, look, I don't know everything, and I'm really open to suggestions here. And we used to call them sort of Chinese Parliament. I know that's not politically correct, but that's what they were called, where the platoon could bring in, or the group that you're with could bring people together and go, right, this is the issue. Let everybody throw an idea in. Some of them would be absolutely ludicrous and we'd never do that, but some of them could actually start the process of that kind of divergent, convergent thinking in real time. And again, you don't necessarily have to have a 4-hour workshop to do that. It could be that you're doing it as a manager or a leader in a business real time after, in a meeting, go, right, we've got this problem, but let's start throwing it out, and not necessarily having this really long drawn out process that people go, I've got a 3-hour blue sky thinking session tomorrow, and actually I could do with that money, time and money back.
Money, yeah.
Yeah, Freudian slip there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I think
I guess the permission's quite important from the leader who has ever organised that, kind of inviting the feedback from perhaps more junior members of the team as well.
yeah, and the vulnerability comes in here, right? So that's again something that's been talked about, certainly in my experience, more and more with clients and people that I work with. How can you be vulnerable and just say, even saying like, I don't know, if he's got some ideas or I need some help with this, this isn't necessarily my area of expertise. That helps people kind of go, okay, well, Mike doesn't have all the answers, and it might be that somebody's sitting there thinking, I've got a really good idea, but I don't want to look silly. And going first, certainly leaders going first with that vulnerability, or even throwing some silly ideas out there and seeing how those land, just to get those, as cliche saying, creative juices flowing. And setting the right conditions and the right environment for people to think more creatively.
Did that happen in the military? Did that vulnerability get shown?
It's a really great question, and I think from my experience it wasn't as good as it is now. Now I still have some really good friends that are still serving, and I know the Army's doing some great work in trying to be more vulnerable and encouraging discussions from not only a mental health perspective but a human performance perspective that aren't the stereotypical, which I think people would think about, is they're told what to do and they do it. But in my experience, in certain environments and certain leaders, they absolutely got the vulnerability piece, and they lost the ego and they got on with it. In other areas, just like in any business, you'll get people that think that their strength is knowing what to do. Actually, quite often your strength is knowing your limits and saying to people that I'm exhausted all my knowledge in this area. Let's throw some ideas in and see where we can get to.
Yeah. One of the things we when we chatted before, one of the things that I think we highlighted that the military do well is the definition of not just the goals. A lot of businesses do that quite well. But the behaviour or the standards, I can't remember the term you used, Mike.
Yeah.
How does the military do that really well?
So this is my Blue Peter moment, James. I've got this book. It's obviously backwards on the
Okay.
but it's
Is that issued if you're part of the military, or
yeah,
I've
I've had this for a while. Don't get me wrong, I don't sit here reading it every day, but it was something that was a massive part of my life as a member of the British Army. And for those serving or have served, I think they could all reel off the values and standards. And this is from sort of day one, week one of basic training. You will be told what the values are. So we've got courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, selfless commitment. And then you've got the standards. And each page has got a little blurb around what does that expect of officers and non-commissioned officers and other ranks. Everyone has the same values and everyone has the same standards. However, how you're measured against those, depending on whether you have position of rank and authority, will be different. So officers and non-commissioned officers typically hold to a higher standard than those who are private soldiers, for example. And that was lived and breathed, where there's an example I tell quite often with some of my clients of an officer was tasked to do a certain job and he hadn't done it.
Right.
And he was trying to bluff his way out of the situation. And this was by a non-commissioned officer who was questioning this officer. And I'll never forget this. So he turned to him and he said, I'm going to remind you, sir, that one of the values of the British Army is integrity. So I'm going to ask you again, did you do this task? And he turned around to this non-commissioned officer and said, no, I'm really sorry I didn't. And there was a discussion as to, okay, why did you feel it was okay to lie? And that officer learned a really valuable lesson that day. And also I learned a really valuable lesson watching that, is where I think, and I say this to companies, is how can you speak truth to power? So on paper, the officer outranked the non-commissioned officer. Yep. But actually from a behaviours and a values perspective, we're saying that actually across the board, this is what we expect from everybody, regardless of rank. So the non-commissioned officer had the courage, which is another value of the British Army, to question this officer in terms of what he hadn't done. Not in a way to embarrass him, although I imagine he did feel quite embarrassed because he'd lied and he got called out, as any of us would do. But to say that this means something a lot more to us, to everybody, than you as an individual. So it's going back to the team again. And where I see it in organisations that get this right do actually, the values and the behaviours mean something to those people, and they're lived and breathed every day. What I think can happen is they become words that are on a wall that business feels I need to have a set of values and behaviours.
Yeah. Oh.
And therefore they mean nothing. Or I think quite often what it is the business hasn't invested time into helping people understand what it means to people in an organisation. I think it helps if you've got an acronym so people can kind of reel it off a bit quicker, but also how you talk about that in those moments where you say to them if it's loyalty or if it's integrity. There's a teaching moment there for that officer and that non-commissioned officer about actually how do we live and breathe these things. But to be fair, it is a very, very intense environment. It is something that's talked about probably daily from a values, behaviours and standards perspective. And we have a set of rules and laws within the military that will uphold those as well. Whereas an organisation, if you break the values, then how that's dealt with will speak volumes about the organisation. And I always say to it, how are values violations dealt with in the organisation? That will tell you whether they're serious about them or not. So you're saying teamwork, and you've got, I don't know, a salesperson, salespeople who are watching this, who are kind of, out there doing it for themselves and not necessarily thinking about the broader team. And, the context of how sales teams set up, we'll put that to one side. We're saying we want teamwork and we've got individuals going off and doing their own things, and we're not calling the teamwork value out, then your words are meaningless and they're on the wall that don't really necessarily have an impact on people, or people lose focus and people lose faith in your values because, Fred's off doing X, Y, and Z, being Jack, and no one's calling him on it because he's bringing in numbers. But actually, the way he's done that is he's left this path of destruction through the business where he's stepping on people's toes. He's, bulldozing into different meetings and hijacking agendas. Although he's bringing in the money, behaviourally, culturally, he's done so much damage that's just going to cost the business more in the long run anyway.
Absolutely. I think I don't want to give those people an excuse, but that's why it becomes so much more important to define them, isn't it? So rather, if you had the word integrity on a wall, that could mean different things to different people. So, the book example you gave there, I mean, that illustrates what good looks like, doesn't it? Calls it out, makes it really clear.
Yeah. I think the challenge for every value that an organisation will have is they're always quite generic. They need to be, because they need to be broad enough for people to understand them. But going back to your point, James, is that how do we define these? Not only as an organisation, because again, the organisation's definition should be quite broad. And if you were to look in this book, again, it would be quite broad. And then it's down for the leaders. And this is where I say to people, if you're quite happy to take the salary and the title, this is when you need to demonstrate the right behaviours. So how are you going to define those at a sub-team level? So organisation, sub-team. And this is talked about quite often, and I will reference the culture and then the climate. So the culture is the organisational culture across the whole of the organisation, and they'll have the values and the mission and their vision. But then the leaders, this is where they earn their keep and earn their money by going, right, how do we then make this real for my team? What does integrity mean for the organisation? What does it actually mean for the marketing team? What does it mean for the sales team? And how does that show up on a day-to-day basis? That takes time and it takes input from people. And often we go, we know what the values are, we know what the mission is, we know what the vision is. Let's just get on selling. And that's where things fall down, because it's the small things that people don't pay attention to, but the small things do add up in the end, where it becomes a bit of hypocrisy, where we're saying we want integrity and we want teamwork, but actually people are not demonstrating integrity and not playing as a team player in order to achieve their aims, but nobody's being called on it. And I think that's the other thing, is what is the consequence here? Who is the accountable person? Leadership, management. But often leaders, again, going back to the conflict word, don't want to necessarily have a word with Fred because Fred's killing it from a numbers perspective, and that's all we're measuring him on. Because we're measuring him on the what, not the how. And that's where problems arise, and people then start to vote with their feet, or you get dysfunction within the team.
Yeah, I guess one of the differences is that those behaviours, those standards, are part of the the businesses or the organisation's definition of success, aren't they? They're integral to it. That's why the army have bothered writing a book. If it wasn't important, they wouldn't write that book, would they? If it was superfluous, they might just stick 3 words on the wall.
Absolutely. It's such a big part of the culture that they've invested, obviously, time into print and publishing a book or publishing internally a book. And I think every half a year, every 6 months, I might be wrong, it might have changed, but certainly when I was in, I think it was every 6 months, you would revisit these. And as a leader in the military, it'd be my job to talk about that. What does this mean for us as a platoon, or what does it mean for us as a company, or whatever the unit or subunit that you're in? And spending some time defining them. Now, some soldiers would roll their eyes and go, "Yeah, I've heard it all before," and probably they have, but they still knew that there was this. If you didn't get this right, there was a consequence. And I'm not saying that all businesses should have the stick mentality versus the carrot, but I think just human nature, quite often, if there isn't a consequence for something, then people will always, human nature is to sort of cut the corner and push your luck and see where you go. And
Yeah.
I think that's another thing from a military perspective is we've got these standards and they're there for a reason. If they are violated or they're broken, then there is a consequence and you will be held to account, which again is all part of being a leader as well. But even if you you didn't meet the standard yourself, some of that was also to have the integrity to put your hand up and say, look, I didn't meet that standard. I showed a lack of either integrity, or I showed a lack of teamwork there, or I showed a lack of discipline and didn't turn up with the right kit at the right time. And that goes a long way because, again, from a vulnerability perspective, saying, look, I didn't meet the standard. And that shows that, yes, we're human, we won't always meet the standard and we will fail from time to time. But you also expect that because you didn't meet that standard, there is a consequence for that, rather than blaming somebody else or trying to have what we call Mr. and Mrs. Slopey shoulders, where it's not my fault, Gov, it's James's fault, he didn't brief me properly, or whatever that excuse that we get. And there is the whole accountable piece. That there's a book by a guy called Jocko Willink, who's a Navy SEAL turned businessman, coach, and whatever. He's got a podcast and he's got a book called Extreme Ownership. So, if you've touched it, own it. You own your part in that as well, which speaks volumes to, again, those right behaviours. Whereas actually sometimes it's easy to go, well, James didn't brief me, I could have had more information. Yeah, you could have all of those things. But actually, if you didn't think it was that clear a brief, then why didn't you go back to James and say, look, I'm not 100% sure on what you're trying to achieve here, because you let me know.
I love that idea of yours of actually going to your platoon or your team and saying, okay, how are we going to live this? Because you've really taken ownership, you're having a discussion, you're really leading it. That's a great concept anyone can grasp. And look, from the other side, from military, there is often quite a lot of tools that are used that have got roots in the military. The STAR model or the leadership model. Are there any particularly that you've taken that you think could be really useful for leaders to apply?
Yeah, I think this is the thing, is that where theory and reality interact can often be very, very different.
Yeah.
So I think theory is good to think about, and again, the military use lots of different models and theories, and actually it's quite interesting to see how these things have evolved from a military context into a civilian one. So after action reviews, or AARs as we call them, something that's been around for years in the military, and then I don't know, maybe over the last sort of 5-6 years, probably longer than that to be fair, I've really noticed businesses talking in using terms as the military do. VUCA is another one. So was it volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous? That was something that was used, I think, coined by the US military in Afghanistan in terms of counterinsurgency operations, and therefore that's now been brought into the civilian world, because we do live in that environment that is pretty standard for everybody, regardless of what sector you work in.
Yeah.
So answering your question, James, one of the models, I guess, that I think is super simple, and again, that helps people get their heads around it, was John Adair's action-centered leadership, which talks about task, team, and individual. So it's a sort of Venn diagram, and then where you want to hit the sweet spot is in the middle of the task, the team, and the individual. And again, I think that was developed by John Adair with the Military Academy Sandhurst, and it talks about those 3 core elements. So when we're leading teams, what's the task that we need to do? So it could be talked about from a strategic perspective, an objective perspective of goal, the individuals. So who are the individuals that need to be players in this game, so to speak, in terms of achieving that task? And then the team in general, what the team needs, what the individual needs, and what the task needs. And looking at those almost not in isolation, but thinking about what's the team, what do they need, right? These things, what do the individuals need? And individuals' needs will be different. Your needs will be different from mine, for example. I'm not saying that I'm always going to meet those needs, because the task might demand that we can't do that. However, from a holistic sort of helicoptering out, as we used to say, and looking at it from a top level down, that can be really good. And it can be super simple. If it's, I don't know, a task that is time pressured and you need to, is urgent, sort of important, urgent, then you might just in your notebook go task. What are the tasks? Boom, boom, boom. What's the team? We need this person, this person, this person, and individuals, these skill sets, these things, so on. And it just gives you a bit of that sort of stand back and think moment of going, right, okay, have I got the right people to do this task, and then bringing them together from a team.
Great, I love it. You can use that pretty much daily, couldn't you, as an application?
Yeah.
What you do.
And what we'd say to people is that if you've got something that works for you, great, use that. Just be aware of, sometimes a strength overuse will become a weakness. So, we've all got our favourite sort of tools and methods and so on. So if it's working for you, just be mindful of using it, and using it in the right proportions as well.
And I guess the individual element of that could be stuff that is how they like to be treated, whether they like to be communicated in a certain way, or whether something's going to motivate those particular people you need on the team. That could alter your perspective on the delivery of that task, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And this is where things like your psychometrics can come in from, who are the individuals, and you can get those reports, whatever model or whatever psychometric tool you use.
Yeah.
Again, this is where I think you and I add values from a business perspective, to say, well, actually, we can come in and talk to you about, yes, I've seen it before where, okay, here, James, here's your report, and you have maybe an intro to DISC or an intro to Insights or Myers-Briggs or Luminous Spark, whatever your preferred psychometric is, and then the business doesn't really do anything with that. And most of the time it's because they don't have the expertise in, and hence this is why you and I have the roles that we do and the businesses that we do, to help people go, right, okay, from an individual perspective, we can use psychometrics to understand the team better. And actually then we can feed in the psychometrics to the team part. And also from a task perspective, there is overlap there to say, well, how are people typically going to go about meeting that task, and how will they do it? And is that the right way that we need to do it from a task team and individual perspective? So it's quite versatile. You can see already just by talking.
Really good share. Thank you very much for sharing that with everyone. If you were to sum up and say, look, what's the most important one or two learnings on leadership you've taken from the military, what would they be?
I think go back to my original point about accountability. Be accountable for what you've done, right or wrong. I used to say to the guys when we were in training, and certainly making a decision, right? Sometimes people don't want to make a decision. So make a decision and be accountable are two massive things. And I always say to them, right or wrong, make a decision. So they get it wrong, and this is why we have training, right? And this is why businesses need to have training, and situations where people like you will come in, and it might be we simulate a business situational task, and we'll get people to fail there, so they learn from it. And that's where it's cliche, but it's true. We'll learn from our failures more than we do our successes. So I think that kind of thing, and to be accountable, hold yourself to account and hold your team to account, and that people know where they stand with you. Then they know what you stand for, and they know that actually I'll speak to Mike because I know that he'll hold himself to account. Or equally, they know that I messed up, I'm going to be held to account here, but not in a way that you're dragging them across the coals and making an example of them. It's just saying, right, what do we learn from that? And how can we apply psychological safety to move the team forward from a performance perspective?
No, thank you. Well, if you were to, dial the clock back 10 years, given what you've learned now about your transition from military into civilian life, what mistake could everyone learn from that you've got with the benefit of hindsight now? Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing for me is asking for help. So think about the environment in the military where you've got your teams, you've got specialist knowledge, skills, experience, and you develop that over a career. And you're just used to having those people around you. It's a very collaborative environment. You've got, even going back to the accommodation where you'd live on camp and you'd have people with you all the time. And the help was there. And that whole sort of teamwork and selfless commitment value, for example, people would see you struggling, they'd come and help you with something, or you clean your weapon or whatever. Once that's done, they'd go and clean the support weapons, whatever it is. But when you leave, I think you kind of, I used to think I could walk through walls and do anything, and actually, when you do leave, you realise quite quickly that you are on your own. You don't have that massive support network, and asking for help from your network, from your friends, relatives, family, whatever it is, or even just whether it's LinkedIn or people like yourself. You and I have a conversation and say, "Well, James, could you help me with this? I'm really struggling with that." And not being afraid to ask for help. And for me, it was a massive hurdle I had to overcome, because I thought I need to prove to myself that I can do this on my own. And actually, let's be honest, none of us are doing this on our own. We've got support networks, we've got family.
Yeah, really, really good one.
Ask for help.
Thank you for being so open and honest, and thank you for joining. I think you've already given us a couple of book recommendations along the way. Extreme Ownership you mentioned already. Anything else to add?
Well, I have this book, and it's called "It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be," and it's by a chap called Paul Arden. And it is a very, very simple book. You could probably read it in half an hour, but there's kind of these little snippets of information in there. I think his background is marketing, and I read it years ago, probably as when I first promoted in the military. And one of them is like, don't seek praise, seek criticism, and not in a kind of self-deprecating way, but we can all probably figure out what went well, but actually, what do I need to work on? What do I need to what do I need to do? And there's things in there, again, a bit like this extreme ownership. Is if you've touched it, take ownership for it. Not even if you're not the kind of project lead, but take ownership of the success or failure of a task, of a objective. Because actually, if you've got people who are like-minded to say, well, we're trying to achieve this, and even if you had a small role to playing it, having a vested interest in the success of that outcome and behaving in that way as well. Not going, well, I gave you the information you needed. What you chose to do, it's up to you. It could be, well, how did I give the information to you? Could that be more clear next time? Could it be more coherent? And what can I learn from that to make sure that the team succeeds in the future? That kind of behaviour, in terms of high-performing teams, is the difference between night and day in terms of people's attitudes towards the success of the team, and removing that kind of blame culture that can manifest in dysfunctional teams.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, James, and thanks for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure.